we've started.
Okay. Good morning, Secretary of State, and thank you for appearing to give evidence today, even if it's taken a little time. As you'll be aware, this committee has been inquiring into retained EU law since the introduction of the now European Union Withdrawal Act in 2018. And as you will also know, we reported ahead of the introduction of the retained EU law revocation and reform bill. We've been looking forward to your appearance since February, and today we will question you on the questions that we're going to put as follows. The government's change in the policy on retained EU law and the current shape of the revocation and reform bill, and what this means for retained EU law moving forwards, and the government's Brexit opportunities work. For those watching at home, would you mind briefly explaining your ministerial responsibilities, including those in relation to retained EU law and Brexit opportunities? You have two officials with you today, one of whom we've met before. It would be helpful, gentlemen, if you could also introduce yourselves and your responsibilities after the Secretary of State has answered the first question. So, Secretary of State, over to you.
Thank you very much. In terms of my ministerial responsibilities, as Business and Trade Secretary, I have been handed responsibility of retained EU law bill, which was previously in the Cabinet Office. And my specific remit is the bill itself and ensuring its safe passage through the House, as well as looking at retained EU law that falls within the Department for Business and Trade. So the machinery of government change moved responsibilities around a bit, and the Trade Department effectively is now looking at this. But in terms of the responsibility for finding laws to repeal, all of those sit with the individual secretaries of state. So that is the answer to the ministerial responsibility question. Did you want me to go into the schedule, or just?
I think I'll just move on. We'll come to the questions themselves in a second. So, Mr. Carr, would you be kind enough to explain what you do?
Yes, of course. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Carr. I'm the Director of Brexit Opportunities now in the Department for Business and Trade. As the Secretary of State has said, the choice of what to do with retained EU law belongs to the individual departments of state. My team's role is to coordinate and challenge the thinking, and broadly to look at three areas of opportunity: the stock of regulations residual from EU membership, the flow of new regulations, and the operation of regulations, how they are enforced and implemented, and what impact those have on the business community. And we work across departments to make improvements in all those areas.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Deeks?
Thank you. I'm Caleb Deeks, actually, not Callum as the tag suggests, but and I'm the Director General for Competition, Markets and Regulatory Reform in the Department for Business and Trade. That covers responsibility for quite a lot of the retained EU law that the department is responsible for in areas like competition, labour markets, insolvency, corporate governance, product safety, and so on. And as of this week, following some changes within the department after the machinery of government changes, I'm also responsible for the Brexit Opportunities Unit.
Thank you very much indeed. Of course, this business of EU retained law refers to laws that have been accumulating for well over 40, nearly 50 years, and therefore is a massively important question now to be resolved. And I'm therefore going to ask the first question, which is that as follows: during the passage of the bill, the government's policy in effect changed from one where retained EU law is revoked unless specifically saved, to one where retained EU law is saved unless specifically revoked. So, Secretary of State, why did you change this approach?
Thank you very much, Chair. So I took on this responsibility in February, and I think as a Secretary of State, it's really important to get under the skin of regulation rather than just leave it to officials and follow whatever advice is given. And I looked at the process, I looked at the intention of the bill, and what I realized was that the law of unintended consequences had reared its head. And the reason why I say that is that the purpose of the bill was to remove legislation really that we did not need. But the way the bill was drafted and the sunset meant that all of the work was being done to look for things that needed to be kept. And my view, especially as someone who voted leave, but also as an engineer looking at how to get the actual outcome rather than just perhaps a linear analysis of what to do, what we needed to do, given that we did not want to change the sunset, that was something I was very clear on, was to focus the attention on reform, what needed to be reformed, and what we knew would already be repealed anyway, and create a power to continue to repeal so that we would not lose the opportunity to reform. So officials had, I think, had been beavering away, working out what things we actually did want to keep. But I looked at the timeline, and I just didn't think that this was a good use of their time. And so I made the decision to ask them to look at an option of a schedule, not just because of the way the time was being used, but also because I feel the transparency is quite key in order to legislate properly. And it was too opaque what we were doing. I had too many, certainly too many for my comfort, representations from all sorts of businesses saying that they found the process to be one that was creating uncertainty. As a new business and trade secretary, I'm sure you can imagine that was something that I took very seriously. But I also looked at the thing that was most in jeopardy, which was the passage of the bill, which was my main responsibility. I can't control what bits of policy other secretaries of state wish to repeal. I can certainly encourage them. But in terms of making sure that the bill passed, doing what it was that we wanted to do, which was ending the supremacy of EU law, that's the primary function of it, interpretive effects in particular, which I think that both sides of the House and both houses have agreed on, I think that we are in a good place, and I think it was the right decision.
On the question of legal uncertainty, I'm sure you would be able to explain the following question, which is, would you not agree that it is more uncertain than anything else to find that you've got legislation which is pre-Brexit being interpreted by the courts in a way that is different from post-Brexit? No,
I don't think so. And the reason why is because when I asked for an analysis of how many areas would have this sort of tension, they were few, but also there is nothing wrong in having certain bits of legislation that came from the EU because they were things that we would be doing anyway. Some of them flow from international obligations. The certainty issue was around not knowing what regulations had disappeared. That was the question the businesses were asking. It was, in effect, the unknown unknowns, that if things just fall away, how will we be able to keep track? And this goes back to the transparency point, that having a schedule shows what is happening, but it also, for those people who do actually want to see significant repeal, it shows the scale of what is being done. Without a schedule, it's actually very easy to pretend that a lot of work is being done to repeal or to revoke when actually nothing is being done. So what the schedule has done is let everybody see the scale of work that is taking place. People can now tell what is going to be reformed, what is going to be kept, and that actually enables us to push more where we think that we need to push in order to remove those bits of legislation that are holding the UK back, because at the end of the day, that is what it's all about. The purpose of this process is not just to remove things from the statute book. The purpose of this process is to make the UK more competitive and not being held back by regulations that we don't need, which 27 other countries decided on.
But of course, the question of interpretation of law by the courts is very important. And there are two different kinds of interpretation with regard to the question of EU law, which is done according to the purposive approach, and then you have the other kind of decision, which is taken under the common law arrangements, and that is very different. So I think, although you answered the question in one way, it does leave open the question of the legal uncertainty that would come from having two different statute books interpreted differently by the courts. But leave that aside. You also mentioned the schedule. When you're referring to the schedule, are you referring to the schedule, which we'll come on to in a moment, which is at the back of the bill?
Yes, of regulations to be revoked.
Yes, but I mean, you only have to look at those for a second. We'll come on to that in a minute, to know that that is not actually particularly relevant in terms of the volume of law and the nature of the law, but we'll come on to that in a second. So I'm now going to move on to the next question I want to put to you, which is, What criteria did you use to identify the pieces of retained EU law that should be listed in the schedule and therefore revoked? I mean, what was the criteria?
So the process was carried out by each department. So it wasn't for me to decide what bits of regulation would go onto the schedule. Every department owns its own policy area. So the Secretary of State for the Environment would decide which bits of regulation would be removed. The same would be for Secretary of State for Transport, and so on. What I was doing was an exercise in transparency. Here is what has been identified. The criteria will stretch across. There'll be a spectrum of things, whether redundancy or actually. I think with the port regulations, for example, that was something which was actually written for a different type of system that was actually not helpful for UK ports. So that's an example of something that was removed because it was actively hindering UK businesses.
But of course, on the question of the Port Services Directive, that is one of very few number, and we'll come on to that in a moment,
yes,
which are really regarded as relevant in this context. In fact, there were 47 port employers, all of whom were against it. There were all the trade unions against it, and the government was against it, but they couldn't do anything about it at the time because we were within the framework of the EU. And of course it is now in, but that's an exception by comparison, as we'll find out later, as compared to the other provisions that are in the schedule. So I now want to move on.
But just to be clear, I don't disagree with you on that. I don't disagree with you at all. I do think that most of the things that have been put on are things that are redundant rather than things that are holding us back. But the point I'm making is that if we leave the decision to mainly officials in terms of what needs to be removed or taken, there will always be a reason. There will almost always be a reason to keep something. One reason, which is a good reason to keep things, is so that we can reform them later. If there are things that we don't like and we remove them from legislation, but actually what we want to do is adjust them, we would have to start the primary legislation process from scratch, which there is no time to do. So there is a purpose for keeping some things that we do want to change rather than just delete. And that is what I want the teams to focus on. If we created a binary process of just revoking or keeping, we actually lose the opportunity for reform, which I think is one of the key points of having this bill.
We'll move on to that for some future questions. Okay. So finally, on my first question, do you agree that in line with British legal traditions for retained EU law that we keep and modify, we should adopt a common law approach to legal interpretation?
That would be a personal opinion that you'd be asking. I'm not a lawyer, but I do think on a principles basis, yes, that is what we should do. But in terms of what the actual outcome or impact of that would be, it would be harder for me to say. So that's where I would start from. Whether that's where I would end up, depending on the specific sort of journeys that would need to be taken on any particular bit of regulation, I think that's a much tougher question.
Okay. So David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, the bill completed its passage through the Commons in January, and it was unamended. And as you've acknowledged, the thrust of the bill, the method of identifying that element of EU law that should be removed, should be revoked, did a 180-degree turn when it arrived in the Lords. You've explained that you decided on a change of approach. When did you decide to make those amendments in the Lords?
I think that this would have been sometime, I'm sorry, I don't have exact dates. It would have been sometime in March, because it would have been about a month, I would say 6 weeks, of looking at everything that had been taking place. And also speaking with the Lords Minister, who gave me his view of how things were looking and what kinds of amendments the Lords would likely pass, looking at some of the correspondence we'd had from all sorts of stakeholders about what they thought. I just didn't think that we were going to end up delivering what we said we were going to be delivering. And you have to remember, the way I think about these things is probably different from lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer. I think it is very easy to write things down and pretend that after we've legislated, everything is just going to work as it's been written. In practice, that often does not happen. So my view is that you look at what is happening rather than just not just what has been written down. And what I saw was a process which was doing the opposite of what it was intended to do. The retained EU law bill became a process of retaining EU law. That is not what we wanted. And so I don't agree that it's a 180-degree turn. I think it's a change in the process. We could have a debate about that, but my view is that what we want to do is get rid of laws that we don't need, and there is a process for that. It is not the bonfire of regulations. We are not arsonists. I'm certainly not an arsonist. I'm a conservative. I don't think a bonfire of regulations is what we wanted. What we wanted was reform and removal of things that we did not need. And this change in process, which I think is still a technical change, is what is going to deliver that. And it's already creating a lot of the impetus, a lot of the momentum, which in terms of showing people what has happened so far. Until I did this, no one knew what was happening. No one knew what was being revoked or reformed. And we could end up in a situation where we're telling ourselves that there's a big bonfire of regulations, and no one would have known what would happen until after the sunset, and then people saw that some things were still there, which we thought we'd repealed. And I was not going to let that happen on my watch.
But isn't it the case that a bonfire of unnecessary regulations is precisely what the Commons voted for?
I don't think so. And I think sometimes what we voted for was getting rid of regulation that we don't need.
Yes.
And that's what is happening.
Yes, but to that extent, what the Commons voted for was a bonfire of unnecessary regulations, to get rid of all those unnecessary regulations. You made the decision to change the approach fairly shortly after you were appointed to your present position.
Well, that's because I don't have control over the timetable. I had to make a quick decision, and I will continue to emphasize this was my decision, and it took a lot of convincing to get the Prime Minister to come on board. But the schedule has been voted in. My new approach has also been voted in by the Commons and the Lords as well. So it has more support than the original status of the bill.
You say that you took the advice of your Lord's Minister. Mm-hmm. Was he concerned that the bill would get a rough ride in the Lords?
I think we're always concerned about bills getting a rough ride in the Lords. Our concern was about the intention of the bill and the outcome being the same, rather than getting a bill through and congratulating ourselves on passing legislation, and then the legislation doesn't work. It has to work, and that is what I'm focused on.
But the attitude of the Lords was a concern of your Lord's Minister?
The attitude of the Lords is always a concern, because the Lords can amend a bill, they can take time, they can slow it down, and given that we have a sunset of 2023, that's just 6 months from now. The bill has not yet received royal assent. There are powers that need to be used in a few months. I think stopping the bill from passing is actually a concern that is very real. We could have ended up in a situation where it was going to ping pong. The length of time would have meant that we wouldn't be able to use the powers at all. And then what would have been the point of that? So we may have an agreement or disagreement about the status of the Lords. I don't think that what we have seen so far in terms of amendments accepted and changes that we've made shows that we're doing anything other than having respect for both houses. Like I said, the schedule was my idea. No one had talked about a schedule. The schedule was my idea, which I felt would help, not just with the smooth passage of the Lords. We're not giving way to many of the amendments which have been put there, but also to deliver the intention of the bill. We would not have even ended up with a bonfire of regulations, as you say, which I don't think would have been right anyway. People need to see what it is we're doing. They need to have clarity or transparency. We would have had an elongated retained EU law process, and that's not what people voted for.
But you've actually departed completely from the approach of your predecessor, haven't you?
I don't think I have departed completely. We're still ending interpretive effects by 2023. But this was a bill that was brought in September under a different Prime Minister and a predecessor who was there for 44 days. I spent a lot longer than that looking at the bill, and I did what I thought was the right thing to do in order to make sure that the bill passed but delivered on its intentions. That is my job as Secretary of State. My job as Secretary of State is not just to do what my predecessor did. It is to do the right thing, and that's what I was doing.
But of course the bill met with the complete approbation of the House of Commons, didn't it, in its original form?
No, well, I don't think so, because the House of Commons...
It was unamended,
the House of Commons has voted on, in support of the amendments. So that is the status.
No, let's go back before it goes to the Lords. The bill went through the House of Commons unamended, didn't it?
Are you suggesting that we should not make any changes to
I'd
any?
be grateful if you would answer.
I just answered it, but I don't understand whether you're asking why any change should be made to any bill at all. Is that the question you're asking?
What I'm finding difficult to understand is that when a bill passes through the House of Commons unamended, and therefore clearly has the complete approbation of the House of Commons, you then change your approach completely. You don't tell the Commons that you're changing your approach. You don't have the courtesy to come before this committee so that this committee can scrutinise the changes that you're proposing. And then you come back to the Commons, it having gone through the Lords, presenting the Commons effectively with a fait accompli. Don't you think that's disrespectful of the House of Commons?
Well, first of all, I would dispute several of the things that you have said. This was a Lords amendment, so the change we would have had to make would always have been in the Lords. We rarely, if ever, give statements on changes to in the Lords. Like I said, I don't believe this is a policy change. We are still delivering the bill's intent. Secondly, the first time I was asked to attend this committee, I'd just been appointed. I didn't know anything about the bill. What would have been the point of me coming here to say, I don't know, I'm not sure yet? I wanted to make sure that I understood what I would be talking about before I sat in front of the committee. And at each time I was asked, 2 or 3 times I said I would come in front of the committee as soon as we could find a mutually convenient time. You know that as International Trade Secretary, I'm often not in the country, so of course that made things difficult. But also, something you're not saying is that we had private meetings, David. We had private meetings where we discussed this extensively because I knew you had concerns. And it's public knowledge that we had private meetings because when I thought I was having private and confidential meetings, I was reading the contents in the Daily Telegraph. So with respect, I would like to dispute quite a lot of what you have said. But secondly, you are saying that the Commons voted for this without any dispute and the Lords changed it. This is parliamentary process. One, this is not the Lords who changed it, but the Lords did support the change that I made to the schedule. And the reason why I made the change to the schedule is because I could see that the intent of the bill was not what was happening. What is the point of us as MPs voting through legislation which is not doing what we want it to do, just so we can say, well, we passed this legislation? Our job is to deliver for the people of this country. And what the people of the country want is reform that makes their lives better, not just saying we've deleted things from the statute book. That is my approach. I think I have done the right thing. It is not my job just to do what any predecessor does. It is my job to look through legislation, make sure it is working, and make sure it delivers to the people, and that is what I have done. And the Commons voted in support of it. The Commons could have voted against the schedule. It did not.
You were clearly concerned about the reception this bill would have in the Lords. Did you ever give consideration to invoking the Parliament Act?
I did.
And what was your decision?
The process for invoking the Parliament Act would have been longer than the date of the sunset of the schedule. So it would have been a complete waste of time. That's the first issue. The second issue is that even letting the Parliament Act process go through, let's assume we could have done it in 2 weeks, would not have changed the material problem, which was that the bill was not functioning as intended, given the amount of effort that needed to be made in terms of retaining laws, whether we wanted to reform them or whether we wanted to keep them, the SI process that was being drafted, the amount of lawyers we would have needed. I just don't think it's an efficient way of delivering the outcome that we want.
As the chairman has remarked, the contents of the schedule consist of measures that are largely junk. That's right, isn't it?
Well, I think we should get rid of junk from this statute.
Absolutely. Well, in fact, you've got 1,400 pieces of junk that were found in the National Archives. Why didn't you get rid of those?
I think those have all gone already, haven't they? That was my understanding. So
don't you know?
One of the things that's interesting about the process is that the retained EU law revocation is happening in parallel with other bits of repeal and revocation. So we've already removed, I think it's about 900, nearly 1,000 pieces of rule, which departments just did without waiting for this. We left the EU a while ago. People did not wait for the rule bill to start removing regulations. But also, there are bills like the Digital Markets Bill or the Financial Services Markets Bill, which are also revoking legislation. So some of the revocation and reform we're doing is in other bills. What this is doing is showing the public what we are effectively revoking now. This would still be what we revoked at the end of the year. This list you're seeing is what you would have got in your bonfire. What I have done is make it very clear what is happening, so that all of the things that people think should be on there, bendy bananas, from one extreme to emissions trading scheme, somebody suggested that should go. I think that's a much bigger project which the Parliament should debate. That's not an SI level type of revocation. Everyone can see what is not going, and then we can have a programme for reform, which is what we're doing.
The most frequently cited reason for revocation, given in your explanation of the schedule, relate to inoperability, redundancy and irrelevance. Couldn't you have used the deficiencies power in Section 8 of the EU Withdrawal Act to remove that beforehand?
Well, I think one of the
50% of the contents of the schedule.
The contents of the schedule are decided by other Secretaries of State. I can't tell DEFRA or DFT which policies they should remove.
I appreciate that.
Pardon?
The point I'm making is that there is a power, isn't there, under Section 8 of the EU Withdrawal Act to remove redundant pieces of legislation. Why has that not been used across the board in order to get rid of legislation such as this?
I think it's one of many powers that exist. So I think departments have some powers that they can use. But again, let's go back.
But why wasn't it used in this case?
So my understanding is that power expired at the end of 2022.
Yeah. Really?
That's what I've been told. So we can't use an expired power.
Well, but what, you've just indicated that officials have been working on redundant pieces of REUL for some considerable time.
In other departments, but I can't use a power that extended before I took on the job, which is the question you asked.
Yes, but why wasn't it already used? That's the question I'm asking.
I think that's probably a question for my predecessor who you've referred to before.
Okay, thank you.
So, Greg Smith, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, the Chairman indicated in his opening remarks and questions that our analysis as a committee of the schedule shows that there are in fact only 5 of the 587 pieces of legislation listed in the schedule that have a substantive policy reason for their revocation, 2 of which are in relation to ports, others on motor fuel and renewable transport fuels. Why is it so few that have such a substantive policy reason? And perhaps to try and bring some clarity from answers you've given both to the Chairman and Mr. Jones before, given that you've stated clearly that we want to make Britain more competitive, but that you've equally gone on to say that this isn't going to deliver, in your words, the bonfire of regulation, and that, again, in your words, you don't wish to be the arsonist on that.
I'm not an arsonist.
On that
I'm a conservative.
bonfire of regulations. Can you tell us, how is this schedule lightening the burden on business?
So, basically, what the schedule is doing is showing you that there would not have been the bonfire that everyone was expecting, because these are the things that had been identified to be repealed. By making the process transparent, we can now show that there is still a lot of work to be done. That work wasn't being done under other predecessors, beyond some of the things that we talked about, the working time directive changes, 2P, non-financial reporting, some of the things which we've announced. So there is good reform work coming, which we can talk about. But the schedule and the sunset are to make sure that we fast track this process before it is too late. we need to use, if we didn't want to change the deadline for ending interpretive effects, so we do need to get this bill through. So the bill has several functions: getting rid of interpretive effects, removing regulation we don't need. But in terms of the answer to your question around competitiveness reform, a lot of the reform work has not been done because everyone is spending their time drafting essays to keep. And that, I think, is not the intention of the bill. So this is the point I'm making, that the way the bill was written was actually causing everyone to not focus on the things that are going to make us competitive. So I completely agree with you. It wasn't working. The change means that we can now just get this through and start focusing on the things that you want to see, which are the elements that will help improve competition. And that's what the Smarter Regulation Programme is about. It's showing people what is happening. It's making sure businesses are engaged, because at the end of the day, it's not civil servants, it's not officials who should be deciding what makes us more competitive. It's the people at the coalface. It's business. It's MPs who speak to their constituents, who have the intelligence there. And the way the bill was written, all of those stakeholders were not part of the process. It was just officials, and what officials will do is look at regulations which they use and assume they need to be kept. You need people who are working in industry to help make those decisions, and that's what I want us to focus now once the bill gets royal assent.
Can I just come back to an answer you gave earlier about some of the representation from business that you took seriously and you cited as a reason why you brought the amendments in the Lords to change the bill so much. What sort of businesses were those? 'Cause I'm trying to understand what the vested interests were in keeping some of this regulation. Are we talking about the umbrella organisations of business, the CBI and so on, or are we talking smaller, medium-sized enterprises?
It was small, medium-sized enterprises. It was people who felt that this was just another way of them having to spend money on lawyers to work out what it was we had done, exactly what we didn't want to do. It was industries like manufacturing, like life sciences, but I need to balance that with the potential for new businesses coming in. What we know is that incumbents are more likely to want to protect the status quo because they're already used to it. So removing regulation and reform actually helps new businesses, probably some that don't even exist, the people who have just decided not to do something because they think the regulatory space is too difficult. But what's interesting is that people weren't saying, please keep this regulation, please keep that regulation. No one was saying that. What they were complaining about was, we don't understand what you're doing. Why are you having a bonfire? Why can't you just be transparent and show us what's happening? And I think that was a reasonable request.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Richard Drax, please.
Secretary, good morning.
Morning.
Just a quick point. You mentioned respect for both houses as part of your thinking. Can I dare say that the House of Lords shows no respect to the House of Commons over the EU issue, as you well know, and has done everything it can to stop it? I don't think that's respectful, do you?
Well, I think I will not say anything disparaging about our noble lords and peers, but you will know that I was in the 2017 to 19 Parliament when it was a hung Parliament, and how what a difficult time it was for all concerned. And what I would say is, as someone who voted Leave, I think that the most important thing we need to do is deliver for the people. They asked us to do something that was quite difficult, but we also, certainly many camps of us, promoted this project as one that would make their lives better. I think that the Lords often have some very reasonable requests. I think sometimes some of the requests are not reasonable. But we need to look at what the end goal is and the quickest way of getting to where we need to get to. And as with every bill, sometimes we need to make concessions. Sometimes we absolutely should not, because it completely removes the intent or the purpose of the bill. The schedule was not something that the Lords asked for, well, certainly not specifically, but where they had reasonable requests, like transparency, like scrutiny, I felt that this was something that would address those concerns, which are also Commons concerns, without giving away the bill to people who actually were just trying to destroy it rather than make it better. I think that there are many peers on both sides of the House who do actually make legislation better. And I really want them to do that on all the things that I'm working on, not just this legislation. But my primary concern is that what we do is right for the people out there. I think it is very easy for us to get into internal conversations about what the Lords did in parliamentary procedure. And out there, it just sounds like navel-gazing. So making sure that we could just get this done quickly and still delivering the purpose of it was what I was trying to do.
Did the Conservative peers...
Pardon me?
Did the Conservative peers agree with your change in tone? Because interestingly, I had supper with 8 of them, was it Monday last, the night of the vote. And they were very confused and some very angry at what was going on.
Well, many Conservative peers did agree. Others had reservations, which I think was expected given that the changes came about after Easter. There just wasn't as much time as I would have liked to have made the case. I think we only got collective agreement for this about a day or 2 days before it went to the Lords. So we had lots of internal battles, even in cabinet, me trying to push some departments, other departments, wanting me to go further. And if you only get collective agreement a couple of days before the amendment is put down, it's very hard to do the groundwork, which probably I would have been able to do had I picked this up in September. But the time is short. It's May. It's May 2023. This bill's powers expire in December. And just making sure that we have something that has royal assent so that we can use the powers is my primary concern.
Whenever I see the EU or hear about the EU, I smell a stitch-up. It's sort of in my DNA, I think. Can I ask you, you've been asked this before, but can I ask you again, and maybe you've had time to think about it, were the changes to the EU retained law bill part of the deal to secure the Windsor Accord?
No, not at all. Honestly, it was one official, one SPAD, and me sitting down and thinking, how can we do this? Windsor Framework had nothing to do with it. I wasn't involved in the Windsor Framework. It's a question that Greg asked. I think it was Greg who asked in the Commons. And what I would say, Richard, is yes, that sometimes it can be conspiracy, and we are politicians. We all conspire one way or another. But on this, I think you just have to trust me. You just have to trust me that I know what I've seen and I want this thing done as well as it possibly can be given the time that we have. But it didn't have anything to do with Windsor Framework.
Can I just pick up on your point? You mentioned delivering to the people. Would you agree that the United Kingdom has still not left the EU?
I would completely disagree with that. The United Kingdom has left the EU, and I think that we are at risk of talking down the significant thing that we have achieved by making the perfect the enemy of the good. We stood on a manifesto to get Brexit done. Brexit meant leaving the European Union, which we did. If we keep telling people that we haven't really left and there's still some other stuff that needs doing, we're not putting the blame on officials or ministers. I think it's...
You missed my point.
All right.
Northern Ireland, would you not agree, is still under the jurisdiction of the ECJ.
Well, we
and
could...
European law.
Well, we
is
could...
it not? Yes or no?
You know just as well as I do what the Windsor Framework was about. This is not my remit. We can have a personal opinion, Richard, you and I can have a drink about whether we think that all of the UK or only GB is still subject to interpretation. I have powers which I've been given in order to make things happen. Windsor Framework was not something that I have any power over.
Okay, I'm just making the point. Sorry to interrupt you again.
I don't want to go outside my own responsibilities.
We can go and have a debate later, you and I, on that particular point. But I just want to make the point. This shows where the mistrust still exists. I'm sure you're speaking, and take your integrity word of honour, but you can see where this level of mistrust is still around and why this bonfire that isn't going to take place,
it wouldn't have anyway,
is still going to leave us at the mercy of many EU laws. Can I now ask you, the government has included a power to remove pieces of our EUL from the schedule, with the result that they will not be revoked. Why do you need this power?
Sorry, I missed that. Which power?
The government, you have included a power to remove pieces of REUL from the schedule,
Yes.
with the result they will not be revoked. Why do you need the power?
Because, so this is just in case there was some sort of mistake that had been made somewhere, and just to reassure, but also the power, did it not have the power to add as well to the schedule?
We can't add to the schedule, but we can repeal.
We can
on an
revoke.
ongoing basis to make mistakes.
It was just a reassurance stating that if there was something that had gone completely wrong, we hadn't jeopardized the bill. So if there was something that went into the bill that we had to take out for whatever reason, if a mistake had been made, I don't think that any have, so it's not a power I expect to use. I didn't want us to lose all of the bill because of an error on the schedule, and that's why it's there. But it is not a power that I am anticipating to use because, as Greg said, these are the things that are the low-hanging fruit. And quite frankly, if there are people who want to take things off, or if we're losing votes where we're forced to use that power, I think it shows that the bill, as it is in more jeopardy than any of us realize. But I don't think that will be an issue.
Okay. Chairman.
So, Greg Smith again, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, the bill now requires the government to publish regular reports setting out its plans to reform retained EU law commitment that was given on the floor of the House, that a regular report to this committee on the progress and plans the government's making retained in EU law would also be made. So can I ask you very specifically, getting into some of the detail, what is the plan and the timetable that you propose for substantive reform of retained EU law that is not revoked by new clause 1 and the schedule? And within that, do you have a list of the retained EU law that you intend to keep in perpetuity?
We're not, well, I'm not sure if I'm looking at perpetuity. I'm looking at what can be reformed. Chris has spent more time looking at the detail of that. Would you go into some of the things that we're doing?
Certainly. We're working with departments on their plans for reform of their retained EU law. They have currently identified things that they want to put on the schedule and get rid of straight away, things that they want to keep for further review, possibly including consultation, which they can then use the revoke and replace power to revoke or reform by June 2026 when it expires. So there is essentially a 3-year programme of reform, and the Secretary of State is working with Number 10 on a series of announcements about that will come.
So there is a smarter regulation programme which was announced with a dear colleague when we were talking about the schedule in the first place. So there are things on labour markets, for example, so the changes to working time regulations. A lot of it is about just removing bureaucracy. That's the thing that business talks about. Why do we have to do all of these things that are not making a difference in terms of us being productive? They're just a drag and they cost a lot of money. So removing a lot of bureaucracy. Because of the system we often have to consult on these things, but before we get to what the actual policy will look like. We're removing things like on the DEFRA side, sort of the wine labelling, which is something that should be quite significant in terms of reducing costs. Non-financial reporting. This is something which falls within my department. So just removing reporting requirements that are just a burden on business, but not actually delivering on things. And we have future ambitions as well. So what I wanted to see was continuous, constant. This has gone, and it's going to make your life better in this way. That has gone, or that has been reformed, and this is how it'll make things better. A comms opportunity which we lose if things just disappear. There's no way of letting people know how well we've.
I'm very pleased to hear about stuff like wine labelling and so on that is going to go. That's great. Clearly, within this process, though, there is going to be some retained EU law that the government's view is, whether it's from your own department or the other departments in government, wish to keep. Some of that might be right to keep. The question is, how do we as a committee and the House of Commons at large scrutinise the reasons for the why it is right to keep in that, and what is the timetable for coming to those conclusions, and how this committee and the wider House of Commons, if necessary, will be able to scrutinise the reasons for why we are keeping those specific pieces of retained EU law on our own statute book.
We're going to come in on a point just now, and then I will go into the substance of that.
Great. I was just going to build on what you were saying and try and bring it to life a little bit in terms of the future path of reform. So if you mentioned some of the areas of labour market regulation that we're looking at, and so prior to the introduction of the schedule, teams that are within my area would have been working on preserving legislation on things like maternity rights, which I think there's quite a lot of consensus and indeed long-standing government commitments to retain, and that would have been dominating their activity over the coming months. Instead, they've now been able to pivot onto reforming some areas of labour market regulation, not taking away rights, but streamlining, making things easier for businesses. You mentioned the Working Time Directive and reporting, but we're also looking at simplifying holiday pay, for example, where we've got a complicated regime that we had inherited from the EU with 2 different types of leave and different ways of calculating pay and so on. And we're consulting businesses on how to make that easier for them to use, how to allow more businesses to use a thing called rolled up holiday pay, which is particularly good for the 4.5 million workers that are on irregular contracts, for example. And we're looking at Tue as well, and the consultation arrangements that businesses have to go through there. In each of those cases, we can't just repeal now the regulation in its entirety, because there are things that we're committed to keeping. But that time that we've got allows teams now in my area to be talking to businesses, working out what will be most effective for them in those areas, and that reform will come through during the coming months. Likewise, on non-financial reporting, huge accumulation of requirements on businesses, many of them from the EU, and we're now in a position where we've got a call for evidence out there until August. Businesses can come to us, shareholders can come to us, what's actually useful there, what can we strip back, and that's underway, and that's where our resources now focus firmly.
But on the point you're making about how do we know why something has is going to stay or go.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why I was very, very happy to sign the amendment which quite a lot of members of this committee had put forward, because it gives an opportunity to do that. I want everybody to see what it is that we're doing, so we can make that part of the reporting measures. But it's just a reminder that if we hadn't done this, you would have been looking at things SI by SI. So you could have 2 regulations broadly similar, one kept, one removed, and the why would have disappeared because different people were sitting on different SI committees. Now we can look at everything holistically. We can spot things that don't necessarily make sense because one department is doing something one way and another department is doing things another way. So I can try as much as possible to corral each of the departments that needs to get rid of its regulation. But I think what I would find very helpful in supporting me in doing that is this committee doing some of that, writing to secretaries of state and asking them that very question. I don't have any levers over them, except being charming and asking them to be nice and get rid of things that they don't need. But I think that having as many people on board doing that, whether it's committees, individual parliamentarians and so on, would be helpful. But now you can see it. Now you can see the...
That's fine. I accept that, Secretary of State. Can I just return for one more go at this point, though, around that which government, in its most generic sense, decides it wishes to keep. There will be retained EU law, the substance of which, whilst it has to be changed from to a common law footing, the substance of which the government will wish to keep. When will this committee start to get lists, for lack of a better phrase, of those pieces of retained EU law with the government's reasoning as to why it wishes to keep them, so that we as a committee can scrutinise the reasoning for why it is being kept to ensure there is a good reason for it to be kept?
Right. So the work I'm looking at is reform. I think that we could end up boiling the ocean again. There's lots of reasons to keep thousands of regulations, and we can have a process for debating each one of those things that we are keeping. That's partly what I try to avoid with the SI process. I think it's what do we want to change rather than what do we want to keep. There's the way to deliver what we want for people. What is it that people out there are asking for? They want things that will make their lives better. Anyone can look at any regulation. The dashboard is public and say, why are you keeping that? And we can answer it. If you want us to go through a process of looking at everything, and I can't speak for other departments, I'll speak for my own, we can do that. But the minute we start doing that, then that's resource that's not being used for reform. I could probably do that fairly quickly. We've done it with the schedule, why we're removing certain things. But in terms of the actual outcome we want, for me, it's not about, I'm not allergic to EU law. Some things are good, some things are no good. Some things, the hassle of changing it means having a big debate, which we probably don't want to have, certainly at this point in the parliamentary cycle. Do you want us to have all of that in a spreadsheet? I think that's a question that you would probably want to ask as well. Is it helpful putting out our entire thinking on every single thing in a political debate? Or should we focus on what it is we're trying to do, which is reform? I would leave that as an open question.
Understood, thank you.
Just before I call Mr. McKinley, of course, the fact is that we haven't had a public discussion about this so far. So it's pretty late in the day, if I may say, given the fact that you've been actually asked to appear before the committee 5 times at least. But
3 of those times were at the same time.
Let us move on. I'm just making the point. We haven't had this discussion yet, and it's now beginning to emerge. So hopefully this exchange will be productive.
Thank you.
And the amendment, which I put down, which the government did accept, which is being tabled this morning, is in its slightly changed, but not in substance, is a step in the right direction. So it does mean that there will be a list, and it will be done on a periodic timetable, and then we'll be able to judge what is on the list, because the government will put forward its proposals as part of its plans, and then we'll also be able to observe what is not on the list, and we as a committee will then be asking questions, no doubt, about why they're not on the list. So I now want to move to Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Just want to pick up a couple of things and ask a couple of your colleagues there. Mr. Drax highlighted the reasons why we're where we are, and you've explained it very fully. So we've got, it was your plan. It was your plan, you looked at where we were, difficulties involved. So just to be absolutely clear, you'd picked up the reins of this department in early February. It would seem not an awful lot had been done. There were likely to be problems in the Lords. You had doubts that what was proposed by your predecessor could actually be delivered. So you're absolutely telling the committee that you had no influence by anybody else, most certainly not the Prime Minister, as part of the Windsor framework arrangement.
The first time I
just want to be absolutely clear, it's got nothing to do with the
first time I
Windsor
told him this, he said no. He said no, we're not doing that.
This was he promised to deliver.
Yeah, he said no. So
he promised.
And I said, I need to do this, otherwise I don't think it's going to work. And I said I would go through a process of talking to the other Secretaries of State, getting more official advice. I think, and I don't know whether Chris and Caleb, actually probably more Chris, I think officials were actually surprised that I had put the schedule forward, because it wasn't something that anyone had proposed. No pressure, this was me, he didn't want to do it, and which is why I have been very, very upfront. I did the UQ, I didn't send a junior minister to do it. We had the private meetings. I know we haven't discussed it in public, we have discussed it privately. I've spoken to many people about this because I wanted to get a sense of how Parliament was feeling about the bill. And the general feeling was that if I didn't think it would work, people trusted me, and I would do what I could to make it work, and that's why we're where we are.
Okay, well, there's obviously been a fair bit of work has been done before you were in post. Substantial amount of work of finding all of this retained EU law bill, including going into the National Archives, the much talked about 1400, and all the rest of it. We've also had the Brexit Opportunities Unit in place for some time, so probably over to you, Mr. Carr. How big was the team that was involved in finding and ferreting out all of this old REUL stuff, wherever it might have been hiding all these years?
So the team I inherited last spring, which had started the review of retained EU law in the autumn of 2021, had about a dozen people working on retained EU law at that point.
This is finding it.
That's right, but it's important to know that they weren't working alone. They were working with several dozen colleagues across all departments to find retained EU law. And if I recall correctly, the original headline figure was about 2,000 pieces that they found in that initial review.
Yeah.
We've then had several iterations of updating the dashboard, adding the 1,400 pieces from the National Archives were not all of one sort. Some of them were not rule and were later analysed to be found to be related to European instruments but not technically fitting the definition of rule. Others were rule that is inoperable, others are still operable but were orphaned by machinery of government changes. So the 1,400 is now included in the figure of the of nearly 5,000 on the dashboard, and as the Secretary of State has said, over 1,100 of them have been repealed or reformed already. That work is still continuing. So my team is now nearly 60. We have been working up until the Secretary of State made this change. We were working frantically with departments on a large SI programme to preserve needed pieces of European law. That's now changed. The focus has shifted from preservation to reform, and we are now working flat out on the Smarter Regulation programme of announcements that I mentioned earlier.
Right, so in the Brexit Opportunities Unit, was that a separate unit with its own team?
No, the team doing the initial rule review in the autumn of 2021 was part of the Brexit Opportunities Unit, which was also doing work on AI and wine and novel foods and other potential areas for reform.
So it's the same team of a dozen?
Well, it was, when I inherited it was about 35 and it's now about 60.
Okay. Right, so Secretary of State, given a lot of work has been done, and we'd identified 4,000 or 5,000, and some have gone already under Regulatory Reform Orders, I assume. So that'd be Regulatory Reform Act 2001 or Legislative Reform Act 2006. Comes to much the same. I don't quite know why we need two acts to do similar stuff. But given that there is a lot of work has been done over an 18-month period, what now are your policy areas that you're prioritising or asking your team to look at and say, these are the ones, as in your words, are going to deliver for the people of Britain and show the benefits of Brexit and all of the rest of it? Yes. What are those policy areas you're particularly looking at?
The principles that I'm starting from are what can we do to reduce the burden on business? Commitments have been made by my predecessors around workers' rights and environmental regulations and so on. So there are constraints already. I'm coming in a constrained environment, but make life easier for people, make things less complicated. And that's where some of the things that we've been talking about, 2P, the reporting areas, that's where we have focused on. There are some things which, I wouldn't mention them here, which I think other departments can do. But they've said they've made commitments, thinking about the net zero department or transport, they've made commitments which are in tension with what I'm trying to do. So we also have a work of making sure that we're all joined up, which is why getting the collective agreement on this probably took a bit of time and also just needed to happen before we could move forward. So those are the principles. And we're also talking about smarter regulation. I don't use the word deregulation because I think others have toxified it. They've made it sound like we're removing safety nets and taking things away from people, when actually what we're doing is making regulation better and smarter. Sometimes that means getting rid of it, sometimes it means changing it so that it can be better. So we're also thinking more holistically about how we do that. Some of the stuff is around looking at what regulators are doing and how the regulators are working. That's not yet a fully formed area, so I can't go into the detail of that. But I think that there is some regulator work that does need attention, which can form part of it. It's not directly related to repeal, but it's all the thing that repealing does is it changes the culture, it changes the mindset. too often, there's no reason why we can't do something. Vaccines was an example. But because we're used to doing things in a particular way, no one tries to think differently. And I think now that there's a big push, smarter regulation, getting rid of EU law, it's a good time to look at regulators as well.
I suppose someone of my mindset would say that old common law values and merchantable quality was a perfectly reasonable way of running British affairs, and it's now being copied by some of the most dynamic economies around the world. But we don't seem to be quite that ambitious by the sound of things. I did feed in to you and your team that there will be 30, 40 years of council and minister decisions. Chairman will always say the same type of script, that we don't really know what they were because there's no Hansard, as it were, that were the preamble to those decision making. But there will be notes and records kicking around in departments to say, yeah, with a sucking of teeth and a bit of a and an ah, we're just going to go along with this because we want to be seen as good Europeans. Yeah. But there must be a list, and I don't know if anyone in your department has prepared that, of issues that we were really objectionable to. We knew we were objectionable to, but the deal had been done, and you know how the things worked in Europe.
I did look at this, and it turned out that most of the things that we objected to were budgets, which just didn't come into scope. There was very little in terms of policy that either there wasn't a lobby for that we agreed with, or we had put forward ourselves. So the budgets were the main area where there was disagreement, and some of the things where there have been
personnel appointments as well. I suppose.
Yes, exactly. So we made quite a lot of representations around those things, which are not where the big wins are going to be found. But I take your point that we're not doing the very simple one line regulation. If we can do that in some places, I think we will. I just think that the world has moved on a lot from how we used to regulate previously, and we've got to deal with things, the world that we have, not the world that as it used to be. And some of that does mean a lot more codification for whatever reason. But we don't need to gold plate. Half the problems we have are not the regulations, but how we interpret them, which is why you go back to what the regulators are doing. It's we just overcompensate for so many things. So the culture change and the mindset change will make a big difference.
Secretary of State, actually the way the system functions is that the Council of Ministers makes the decisions behind closed doors by majority vote of the other countries, and as you pointed out, Mr. McKinley pointed out, without a transcript. So the real reality, and I've been on this committee since 1985, and I've therefore got some knowledge of how it operates, and I can only say that actually most of it was done by consensus, because they knew that they weren't actually going to be able to vote against anyway, because we were promised a veto in 1971, and that was whittled away to non-existence. So for practical purposes, the suggestion that there's nothing much wrong with the way in which the European Union arrived at its decisions and the quality of the laws that were passed flies in the face of the fact that we had no option. We couldn't exercise a veto, and therefore there was a consensus arrangement which permeated the lawmaking right the way through from 1973.
I don't disagree with that at all. It's just that that's the point you've made, that using that as a basis is difficult because the records aren't there. So I can't.
Well, they are, because, excuse me, Secretary of State, we in the European Scrutiny Committee have the records that go back to 1973.
Of the deliberations.
No,
that's what I mean.
We have explanatory memoranda, which have been supplied all the way through that entire period from 1973, I emphasise, and they are in our archives, and actually they are all there, and we can make them available, which brings me to the next question.
I will come to the conclusion.
I'd like Mr. McKinley to finish his first.
Yeah, what might we be able to expect before the end of the year to get some really clear wins? You've laid out the areas you're looking at. What ones might we be able to expect to come back to this committee, working with obviously Mr. Carr's department, to actually lay before us, say this is the next batch, these are why we're doing it, these are a great idea, so we can give you our comments on whether we hopefully agree.
So there is a plan, and I've seen it. How much can we say without without spoiling the griddle. So some of it, these are lovely announcements that we want to make at some point in the future, all before December. So there will be about 4 or 5 moments of things which we are doing, and here's a new batch. So we've done one batch already, and there will be some coming before recess and next term as well. And what I would say is that the time to find things is now. This is the best, and we can continue to revoke, but finding them now is absolutely key. And I can ask all the fresh young graduates, what should we repeal? But they just don't have the work knowledge to be able to do that. It has to be businesses, whether it's the representative organizations, whether it's new entrants in particular, those people who are really novel, really radical, constituency MPs from across the aisles. We're the ones who are going to do this. And then we can tell officials what we want to do, but we can't just ask them, go do it. I think one of the things that's really bothered me was this looking like officials weren't doing anything, which I think was not fair. They were doing what they felt was the right thing to do, and I looked at it and decided that this was not the way to do it. Let's change the approach and deliver the intent. And I know we've run over time, but there is one thing that I would like to say to the committee, and that is that the easiest thing for me to have done would have been just to sit back and do absolutely nothing. That's the easiest thing I could have done. Done with all of the hassle, all of the debates, all of the, trying to convince people, using up political capital with the Prime Minister. I could have done absolutely nothing and just let the bill coast. And quite a few people do that. That would have been the wrong thing to do. And I hope that the evidence that I've given in this session can show that I took the difficult decision, but it was the right one.
I believe that if there's any final questions from anybody else, Joe.
Yes, I'd like to ask another question on this. Will you instruct Mr. Carr and his team to consult the committee on how this work can best be achieved? We've got the records. We would be happy to talk to you, and if you could be good enough to make an arrangement with us, that would be very helpful. Mr. Drax would like to ask a question, so would Mr. Jones. And so would Mr. Gant Robinson.
Meant to pick up. What are the Lords with through further changes? What we do?
Well, my view is that we need to deliver what we said we were going to deliver on rule. If there are changes which, by some in some way, make things better, some of the most unhelpful things, certainly from the perspective we've been speaking from, have actually been Conservative peers. Many of the amendments which would have really tanked this bill were Conservative peers. So it's not necessarily a party political area. But my view is that
some of the
hostile amendments to the bill
were
from Conservatives. It wasn't just
in the House of Lords.
Yes. It's just following up on the point that you were making. So I think my personal view is that we have made a substantive change in approach, which should deal with the things that the Lords complained about, which I felt were reasonable: transparency, clarity, and so on. Now we need to focus on reform.
So you'll stand your ground?
I will be standing my ground. I will be standing my ground. We've now gone through the first stage of ping pong. I think there is a risk that the bill falls. I don't want if they keep coming back on things that we have voted down. I think that this is the point you were making about respecting the Commons. I think that we've talked about not using the Parliament Act, that the Lords should see that as us being respectful, and I would like to see some reciprocity there as well. So we're doing the engagement, and Lord Callanan has been doing a really good job, actually, in terms of engaging with Lords as a Conservative.
As you said, keeping the government's feet to the fire. Mr. Jones, please.
Just briefly, I was slightly disappointed in the answer you gave to Mr. McKinley when he actually extolled the virtues of the common law. The common law is a huge asset of this country, and more jurisdictions across the world are actually adopting the common law because it's easy to understand, it's predictable, and it's fast. Your response to him was that there will be a continued need for codification.
No, that was...
I mean, if I may finish, it's slightly worrying. Is your approach going to be that you will not be sweeping away this foreign law that inhabits our own system, but you will be retaining a lot more than maybe members of this committee would like.
No, I don't think that's what I said at all. I said in terms of regulating, the world we live in often means the codification is required. In the digital realm, it's very hard to use common law. It's not 1970 anymore. Looking at, I'm an engineer by background, tech is where I used to work. You do need some codification, you do need some standards. This wasn't a debate about common or Napoleonic law. It's about how we can get certain things to work, and that's what I mean.
You acknowledge the strength of the common laws.
I think I did much earlier in the session when I agreed with the chair, so yes.
Mr. Robinson, please.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. 3 things from me. I think at the start of this session, in response to Mr. Jones, and then more latterly, you've indicated that when you were appointed as Secretary of State, you were the person, you would make the decisions, and you weren't there just to follow what had previously been agreed. But yet, in response to Mr. McKinley, you lamented that you were operating in a constrained environment, and that commitments had been given in respect of employment rights and other issues. So which is it? Do you agree with the constrained environment in which you work, or do you lament?
Well, both. So where I think that the intent of a bill is not going to be seen, I think I can operate around those constraints. But where the constraints are there to help the passage of the bill, and I think that is why Jacob made those reservations, then we should do so. So it's not there's no hard and fast rule.
So you
it's
agree
about
with the commitments given, and the
well, we're certainly I think we would need to start looking in detail about which regulation is it that we want to remove. In terms of what we're trying to achieve, getting this book on the statutes, getting this legislation on the statute book and repealing, that's critical. You've seen with some of the law's amendments on environmental regulations, we saw this with loads of EU legislation. We can end up arguing about policy rather than the principle of what we're trying to deliver. And then it's, should this bill deal with sewage? Should this bill deal with animal welfare or puppy farming and all of those sorts of things? And actually, in terms of delivering what we said we were going to deliver, remove things that we think are holding the UK back, we're in the right place. We can continue to revoke, but let's then have those arguments on a case by case basis.
In February, there was a report by the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee where the government had indicated that any substantive change to this bill would be advanced through primary legislation rather than secondary legislation, and not use secondary powers. Does that remain your position?
I'm not sure I've seen this.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
No. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee conducted an inquiry into this bill, and they published a report in February. And as part of that report, the government had indicated to that committee that any substantive changes to this bill would be brought forward, when it's an act, brought forward by primary rather than secondary legislation.
All right, I'll let you answer that, because this
even though there was a power contained within it that would allow you to via secondary legislation to amend. So
I think if I understand the question correctly, the commitment has been given not to change the rule act when it is an act by
secondary legislation.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes, I think that was
so
a previous Secretary of State.
Is that still your position?
Well, it is, and I can have another look, but it's not. This is. I would have to write to you on that. I don't like speaking about things that I haven't.
Could I ask you to write to the committee about that, and separately and subsequently to that, indicate what areas you feel would be captured, what would be significant enough or sufficient enough to invoke primary rather than secondary legislation? And then, Secretary of State, you have mentioned and indeed majored on a number of occasions in this session about the need for your request for your belief in transparency around this process. And I scratch my head when I listen to the sort of cavalier approach, if you will hear from me, about the union and the union in all its parts and the implication of Brexit on the union. But I can see nowhere in the schedule or indeed in any efforts for transparency about what process has been engaged with to discern what impact legislation revoked in the schedule would have on the UK internal market.
I think that we have gone through quite an extensive process on this. A lot of work has been done consulting with devolved administrations. I think that we have looked at how we can make sure that we respect the devolved powers, how to make sure that where they really feel that they need to preserve some legislation, that they're able to do so.
Can I say that's quite a separate thing, Secretary of State, because engaging with devolved administrations and so on, that is sort of par for the course, and it's the ordinary appropriate machinery of government.
Yeah.
We're talking about legislation here. We're in the first cut of this bill, Section 1, subsection 4, Article 1, sub-Article 4, excluded provisions that apply to Northern Ireland. You have now introduced a schedule which specifically indicates which laws are being revoked. You have told us in this session that you're not responsible for the content of that schedule, that aspects of that schedule came from sponsoring departments. I am asking what process and assessment has been conducted in light of the commitments given under the UK Internal Market Act 2000 and the role of the Office of Internal Market. And I'm suggesting that, albeit you have majored on transparency, I'm struggling to see that those assessments have been conducted, or that I, as a Northern Ireland representative in this United Kingdom Parliament, have any sense that our government is seized as to whether the revocation of those acts will impact on our ability to trade within our own country.
Okay. So, in terms of how it interacts with UKIM, this is one of the things which I would have expected representations from devolved administrations, or rather Secretary of State for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. This is not an issue that they have raised with me. I know that it has been considered because I have a note about how the UKIM Act framework would continue to protect businesses. This was something that was looked at. We can send you a longer note in terms of our thinking. It hasn't been mentioned because it hasn't been asked about, but it is something that was considered.
So, Secretary, you are an empowered person or a relevant authority under the UKIM Act?
Yes.
Nobody else. This is your bill. You have taken the title of pieces of legislation and placed them in your schedule. And I'm asking you, have you specifically satisfied yourself that there have been considerations for each aspect of that schedule and an assessment on its impact on the UK internal market as per the Act?
Well, yes, because I think that's one of the reasons why certain things are not on the schedule.
So you can specifically say that there are aspects not on that schedule because of their impact on the internal market?
I think that is something that we can say.
And is that something you could write to us specifically about?
We can have a look.
And in the interests of transparency, are we able to see assessments based on every aspect of the schedule for its impact on the internal market?
Well, we've certainly given a reason for why everything on the schedule is there. I think that can probably be inferred from looking at it.
It cannot be inferred because it is not transparent, and it doesn't give me, the people I represent, or anybody who has an interest in the integrity of this country, whether that process has been conducted and what the outcome of that process is.
So what I would say is that it would still be better, the schedule is still better, than just having the regulations fall away because no one looked at them at all. So this schedule is still an improvement on the specific problem which you're outlining. This is better in terms of the impact on the internal market. So we can look at what more information can be provided.
So I'm not arguing that it's worse. I'm just arguing that, albeit you've suggested this is to improve transparency, and
that you would like more transparency.
Sense, it does. It gives no comfort whatsoever to someone like me who doesn't just hear and agree that we got Brexit done. Okay. So I'd be very keen to get as much information as that as possible to the committee and writing to the chairman, and if we need to follow up, I'm sure we shall.
All right, thank you. I really must go. I've been told that I'm now late for my next meeting. I was told that this session would finish at 12:15.
Before you go, Secretary of State, I mean, we have waited a very long time for you to come.
Yes,
it was in February 24th.
Yes, but you've also, if I may, Chair, we've waited a long time so that I could answer the questions. I would not want to come in front of this committee and say, I don't know, I will write to you.
No, but there is a question I do want to ask you, because it relates to the question of the proposal we put to you about having a czar to help to speed up the process and to make it really effective in terms of European scrutiny, and also to make sure that the person who was doing it would be fully acquainted with EU scrutiny and lawmaking. We've been into that just now. I just simply want to ask you a very simple question. Would you be good enough to appoint a retained EU law czar to help the process and we were discussing, as Mr. Carr and you have both agreed, to consult with the committee, because the need to coordinate, which you've already said presents you with certain problems regarding other departments, could be helped by having proper consultation with us and also having an EU law czar who is a kind of commander-in-chief who can help to make the process work. Would you agree to that? Do you think it's a good idea?
I think we can certainly have an individual who does that. We will probably quibble about who that should be and exactly what their powers are. But in principle, it's not something that I'm against.
The process and how it was all devised under the EU regime, then that would be a step in the right direction.
Would you like to be the czar?
I think some people would say I'm the czar of this committee, but that's another story. So I think we will continue to continue with this process. And I'd simply like to say very finally that you did hire a law firm to go through the question. I think Hogan Lovell, I think their name is. What are the terms of reference that you've given them to do that? We don't know much about what they're doing.
We can write to you on this.
Could you?
Yes.
Terms of reference would be very helpful because it is £4 million of taxpayers' money, which